Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity has a habit of settling in quietly and taking its time, and where the mysteries of our planet become a comfortable place to rest your thoughts. Tonight, we're wandering into a topic that has managed to stay both familiar and surprisingly elusive. A topic that hides in museums, history books, travel photographs, and old documentaries. A topic built out of stone, sand, clay, and memory, yet somehow manages to feel like it's still unfinished. It's the idea that ancient structures scattered around the world might not be as isolated as they seem. That instead of being a collection of individual achievements, they could form a larger pattern, a network, or something shaped through connections no one today fully understands. Not in a dramatic sense, but in the quiet way certain things stay aligned across continents, even when the people building them had never met, traded, or shared a language. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're in a place where old temples or ruins are part of the landscape. Maybe you're far from anything carved in stone, but this topic still manages to bring up a sense of curiosity for you. Wherever you are, what time is it in your corner of the world, and what brought you here at this moment? It's always interesting, especially for a discussion about hidden networks, that all of us arrive at the same point from such different routes. If you find this slow, steady exploration relaxing or simply a nice way to drift towards sleep after a long day, it would mean a lot if you liked the video or subscribed. It helps this quiet space reach others who enjoy thinking about the Earth in a way that doesn't rush. So let's settle in, take our time, and walk gently into this idea together. Because within the stones, walls, pathways, and monuments built long before any of us arrived here, there might be threads that connect them more tightly than we usually assume. Most of us grow up learning about ancient structures in separated categories. The pyramids in Egypt belong to one civilization. The stone circles in Britain belong to another. The Nazca lines to another. The temples of Cambodia, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the mounds of North America, the stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica, the megaliths of Malta, the rock-cut architecture in India, the monoliths of Easter Island. Each presented as its own chapter, its own isolated achievement, each culture credited with its own reasons and methods. And from a historical perspective, that approach is practical. It keeps timelines orderly. It makes it easier to fit civilizations into paragraphs and museums. But at some point, you start noticing that many of these structures share features that shouldn't logically overlap. Similar alignments, similar shapes, similar construction techniques, similar orientations to stars, solstices, or cardinal directions, even similar choices in where to place them on the landscape, not vaguely similar but sometimes remarkably consistent. And then there are distances, very large distances that seem too great for shared plans or shared knowledge, yet the buildings left behind often hint at similar priorities. When you think about that long enough, even in a calm, steady way, it becomes natural to wonder if these structures were really as separate as textbooks imply. Not necessarily connected through direct communication, but connected in a different sense. Connected through systems that might have been bigger than we imagine, or through knowledge that travelled farther than we typically assume, or through patterns that humans tend to recreate without intending to. Before getting to the details, it helps to pause with a basic question. Why did humans, across vast stretches of time and geography, keep putting enormous effort into building things out of stone? Stone is heavy, difficult to shape, and slow to work with, and yet time after time, across continents, people chose it for their most important structures. There's something grounding about that choice, something steady, something almost predictable. It suggests that whatever these structures represented, people wanted them to last. Not decades, but centuries or longer. Not for the benefit of the builders alone, but for generations far beyond them. And then there's placement. Many ancient structures are not just placed anywhere. They stand on ridges, hilltops, coastlines, desert plateaus, river junctions, fault lines, magnetic anomalies, and points that offer unusual visibility of the sky. Some are positioned with distances that form geometric paths when traced across maps. Some align with solar events so precisely that even now, thousands of years later, the sunlight still hits certain stones at the same angle it did when the builders first set them in place. That isn't an accident. That's planning. Planning done quietly, patiently, and with an understanding of the land and sky that required long-term observation. Once those details start to build up, it becomes easier to imagine how someone might look at the Earth not as a collection of independent regions, but as a single surface holding many pieces of a shared puzzle. Not necessarily planned as a global system, but built in ways that reflect similar priorities. People everywhere watched the sun rise and set. People everywhere looked at stars to navigate, mark seasons, or plan harvests. People everywhere found certain shapes appealing because they were stable or symbolic. And if you scatter those patterns across thousands of years and thousands of miles, the result can start to resemble a network even if no one intended it that way. Some researchers focus on geometry. They draw lines between ancient structures across continents and find that some of those lines align more closely than random chance would predict. Others focus on astronomy, pointing out that different civilizations oriented important structures toward the same stars without having the ability to share that information directly. Others look at materials and notice that people across the world used enormous stones for reasons that were practical in some cases and symbolic in others. Others look at myths and notice stories involving similar themes of creation, sky beings, underworld passages, or world mountains appearing in cultures that never met. But the question here isn't about whether every theory is correct. Instead, it's about what happens when you take a slow, careful approach to the idea itself. Not rushing toward conclusions, not pushing it into sensational territory, but simply observing the patterns with curiosity. Patterns that might be intentional, patterns that might be coincidental, patterns that might reflect something about how humans see the world, or how cultures respond to their environments, or how knowledge travels through generations without leaving a clear written trail. It's interesting how knowledge can behave like that. It can spread quietly, through oral traditions, through travellers, through patterns in nature, through trial and error repeated across continents. And once enough people repeat the same kinds of observations, even without direct contact, they can create systems that look connected from a distance, structures that are separated by oceans and centuries but still reflect similar thinking. Almost as if the Earth itself was the shared teacher, and people in different regions eventually reach similar ideas because they were responding to similar cues. There's also the question of how much we might be underestimating the capabilities of earlier civilizations, not in a dramatic or exaggerated way, but simply acknowledging that ancient societies were often more observant and more skilled than we give them credit for. Many of them spent generations watching the sky. Many of them mapped their surroundings with care because their survival depended on it. Many of them developed mathematical systems that were surprisingly advanced, even if those systems look different from what we use today. If you combine astronomy, geometry, environmental awareness, and the ability to coordinate large groups of people, the result can be structures that appear connected even when they were not built with each other in mind. Another part of this idea comes from the human tendency to look for meaning in patterns. Sometimes those patterns lead to accurate insights. Other times they lead to questions that help refine our understanding. And sometimes they simply give us a new angle to look at old structures without trying to force an explanation. It's not about deciding whether the network is literal. It's about exploring the possibility that ancient builders were more aware of their world than we assume, and that their decisions might reflect a broader worldview. When you think of an Earth covered in ancient monuments, each placed by people who looked at their landscape carefully, who planned for generations beyond their own, and who put their most important beliefs into durable forms, you start to wonder what they might say if they could speak to one another across time. Not with language, but through the shapes they made, the directions they selected, the choices they repeated, and the persistence of their ideas. those ideas might be the closest thing to a network we can trace. A network made not from roads or communication lines, but from priorities that remain surprisingly consistent across cultures. If you imagine the Earth as a single canvas and place all the major ancient structures on it, the distribution becomes easier to notice. They cluster in areas with early agricultural development. They align with regions where the sky is easy to observe. They appear along coastlines where travel between regions was most common. They appear near rivers that supported large populations. They appear in places where the geography naturally encouraged gathering, ceremony, or long-term settlement. When you see enough of these clusters, the idea of a network becomes less about a hidden system and more about a shared pattern of human behaviour that repeats because the circumstances repeat. That doesn't reduce the mystery, it adds to it in a different way. Instead of imagining a single explanation, you start to see ancient structures as part of a larger conversation held indirectly across time. A conversation carried through building techniques, choices of stone, understanding of the night sky, and the desire to anchor important values in physical forms that would outlast their own lifetimes. That conversation becomes clearer the more calmly you look at the evidence. It's a slow realization rather than a dramatic one, and it opens the way toward exploring the shapes, alignments, distances, and purposes that come next, without needing to rush toward answers. When you start looking closely at the way ancient structures are arranged on landscapes, it becomes clear that many of them didn't appear randomly or without long consideration. The placement, the layout, and the scale often suggest that the builders were responding not only to the needs of their communities, but also to larger patterns they observed over generations. It's easy to forget that the people who built these early monuments lived in environments where careful attention to the sky, the seasons and the terrain wasn't optional. It was essential. So the patterns that show up across continents may not be accidental or mysterious in the dramatic sense, but rather the result of people repeatedly solving the same kinds of problems and asking the same kinds of questions, even if they lived far apart. One of the simplest examples of this comes from the way many monuments align with the cardinal directions. It appears at first like a basic, almost obvious choice, but aligning anything precisely to north, south, east, or west requires knowledge that has to be built up over time. Many ancient communities learned to find true north by tracking the movement of stars. Some used the shadow of a stick over the course of a day. Others developed methods involving the rising and setting of the sun at certain times of year. No matter the technique, the result is consistent. Across the world, many structures face the same directions. It's not because the cultures were communicating with each other, but because they were all trying to solve the same practical challenges, and the cardinal directions gave them a dependable reference. This kind of consistency shows up in more complex ways too. For example, the repeated use of rectangular layouts in temples or ceremonial centres. Rectangles appear in ancient Egypt, in Mesoamerica, in China, in Europe, and in regions of Africa and the Middle East. The shape allowed for predictable construction, stability, and clear organisation of space. Once a civilization began farming and settling more permanently, the rectangular or square form became useful for storage, community planning, and ritual structures. Over time, it also became symbolic, often associated with order, stability, or the structure of the world as the culture understood it. Another noticeable pattern is the preference for elevated locations. Hills, ridges, plateaus, and coastal cliffs often serve as the setting for major monuments. The reasons vary. Some placements improved visibility, turning a structure into a landmark that could be seen from far away. Some offered defensive advantages. Others might have been chosen for practical reasons, such as staying above seasonal flooding. But many cultures also associated higher ground with spiritual importance. The sky was a point of reference for navigation, seasons, and mythologies. Placing a temple, pyramid, or stone circle in a location that drew the eye upward reinforced beliefs about the connection between the ground and the heavens. The pattern becomes clearer when you consider that ancient people spent a large amount of time outdoors, observing the same cycles year after year. These cycles were reliable. The sun rose and set in consistent arcs. Stars moved across the sky in ways that could be predicted with enough patience. Seasons shifted at slightly different times in different regions, but the overall rhythm remained the same. If you live your entire life within those cycles, and if your culture passes down knowledge of them through stories, rituals, and repeated building efforts, the structures you leave behind naturally reflect those observations. Yet another pattern appears in the way certain shapes repeat across continents, despite the cultures having no contact. Circular structures, for example, appear in Britain, Africa, the Middle East, the Pacific Islands, and parts of Asia and the Americas. Circles provide even distribution of weight and allow people to gather around a central point. They also offer equal visibility from all sides and create a sense of inclusion or unity. Because circles are easy to draw using basic tools, and because they offer practical advantages, they show up repeatedly in the archaeological record. Pyramidal shapes too appear across unrelated civilizations. Step pyramids, smooth-sided pyramids, terraced pyramids, and mound-like pyramids can be found in Mesoamerica, Egypt, China, Sudan, and among early North American cultures. The reasons vary depending on the region. Some served as tombs, others supported temples, others acted as platforms for ceremonies, but the shape itself is stable, can be built in layers over time, and supports its own weight well. Once people learned how to stack stones or bricks effectively, the pyramid form was a logical outcome. These repeated forms didn't require long-distance communication to appear. They were shaped by practical needs, by environmental conditions, and by ideas passed down through generations. But when you step back and look at all of them on a map, they start to create a picture that feels remarkably cohesive. Not every pattern is structural. Some patterns show up in the orientation toward astronomical events. Solstices, equinoxes, lunar cycles, and certain star risings seem to have been important to cultures across the world. In many places, people tracked the movement of the sun not because they were developing a unified plan, but because agriculture depended on knowing when the seasons would shift. The solstices mark the longest and shortest days of the year. The equinoxes mark equal daylight and night time. These events signalled when to plant, when to harvest, and when seasonal migrations might begin or end. Temples, stone circles, and other monumental structures often incorporated alignments that made these events easier to observe. For example, the movement of shadows at specific angles during certain times of year can signal seasonal change with impressive accuracy. Builders could create a narrow opening that lets in a beam of sunlight only on the solstice, or they could position a row of stones to frame the rising or setting sun at a particular time. When these features show up in multiple cultures across the world, it may look like a shared system, but more often, it simply reflects a shared need for reliable timekeeping and careful observation of the sky. Patterns also emerge in how different cultures place their structures relative to nearby sources of water. Rivers, lakes, springs, and coastlines often became focal points for ancient communities. Water supports food production, provides travel routes, and shapes local mythology. It's not surprising that many of the world's oldest structures are found near water sources that were considered vital to survival. Even when cultures lived far from one another, their reliance on water created similar settlement patterns, and those patterns influenced where they built their monuments. There's also the question of materials. The widespread use of large stones appears in various regions. In some cases, the stones were chosen for durability. In others, the size signalled importance or demonstrated a community's capacity to work together. Moving large stones required cooperation and long-term planning. It demonstrated stability, organisation, and communal effort. When people look back at such structures today, the stones seem almost intentionally placed to create a sense of weight and permanence. But often this effect was not symbolic alone. It reflected practical choices. Large stones resisted erosion, pressure, and the passage of time. Another overlooked pattern is how many ancient cultures built near fault lines, or areas with unusual geological formations. Not necessarily because they understood geological processes the way modern scientists do, but because regions near fault lines often offer unique water access, fertile valleys, and striking landscapes. Over long periods, communities noticed that these areas supported larger populations, or offered better views of the sky. They might have also believed certain geological features held cultural significance. Today, when you look at maps showing the distribution of ancient structures relative to geological boundaries, the patterns become easy to spot even if the civilizations had no direct contact with one another. These details begin forming a picture where the Earth itself influences the placement and characteristics of ancient structures. The planet's natural patterns interact with human needs and perceptions, and the result is a global patchwork of similar choices. That patchwork can appear coordinated even when it isn't. Some researchers describe this as a kind of mirroring effect. People respond to their environment in ways that are consistent across cultures, and the monuments they build reflect those responses. It's also worth considering how knowledge was passed down within each culture. Many ancient societies relied on oral traditions, apprenticeship systems, and long-term observation. Skilled builders taught their methods to the next generation. Astronomers passed down their observations of the sky. Farmers shared information about seasons and weather. Over many generations, these pieces of knowledge formed stable traditions. When combined with the slow pace of architectural change in ancient times, those traditions produced long-lasting patterns. The structures built at different times within the same culture often share features because the methods were consistent. Multiply that across many cultures facing similar environmental challenges, and you get global echoes of the same ideas. These echoes become clearer when you examine the way some structures relate to the surrounding landscape. Many monuments aren't only aligned with the sky, they also align with nearby mountains, valleys, coastlines, or other features. These alignments might not represent a single global system, but they reveal a shared way of thinking. People saw their environment as interconnected, and they built structures that acknowledged those connections. This approach appears in temples aligned with mountain peaks, stone rings aligned with nearby ridges, and buildings designed to frame views of significant natural landmarks. Because these choices create repeated patterns, they raise questions about what ancient people understood collectively. Did they see the Earth as a system with predictable cycles and relationships? Did they interpret the sky the same way? Were they using similar techniques because those techniques consistently worked, or because the knowledge spread more widely than we assume? These questions don't require extraordinary answers to be meaningful. They simply open the door to looking at the ancient world with more context. There's also something to be said about the human inclination to organise space. When people settle in one place for long periods, they develop ways of dividing land, arranging buildings, and creating ceremonial areas. Some patterns emerge because they make everyday activities easier. Others emerge because they reflect cultural beliefs. But over long periods, those patterns become standardized. Once a culture adopts a particular layout, it tends to repeat it even when circumstances change. When you compare these standardized layouts across cultures, similarities become easy to recognize, even if the cultures developed them independently. Many ancient communities placed their ceremonial centers near the heart of their settlements. Others placed them at the edges, separating sacred areas from everyday life. These choices often reflected the culture's perception of purity, power, and the role of ritual. Yet when archaeologists map these different approaches across continents, similar solutions appear repeatedly. The same can be said about the use of symmetry. Humans tend to find symmetrical shapes practical and easy to construct. Symmetry also helps distribute weight evenly in large structures, and because it satisfies basic visual preferences, it shows up across many cultures. Whether the builders were constructing temples, pyramids, administrative buildings, or houses, symmetrical layouts appear again and again. It's also important to remember that many of the monuments we study today were built over long periods. Some were expanded, remodelled, or refined over generations. This long development period stabilised the patterns within each culture. A structure aligned with a solar event might be adjusted over time to maintain accuracy. A building placed in a specific orientation might be extended while preserving the original alignment. Because of this, the patterns persist in ways that make them more visible to modern observers. When you collect all of these patterns and place them side by side, they form a recognisable set of tendencies shared across ancient civilizations. These tendencies aren't necessarily evidence of direct connection. Instead, they show how humans across the world responded to similar challenges and goals. They looked at the same sky, lived on the same planet, and developed solutions that repeated naturally because they were effective. In a way, these patterns act like a quiet reminder that ancient people were more similar to one another than we sometimes imagine. They valued stability, observation, and long-term planning. They learned from their environment and preserved knowledge across generations. They chose locations and designs that supported their communities. And even though they were separated by vast distances, the shared features of their structures reflect the shared logic behind them. Exploring these patterns doesn't reduce the significance of ancient structures. It broadens our understanding of why they appear the way they do. It adds depth to the idea that the world was shaped by people who paid close attention to their surroundings and made decisions based on generations of accumulated knowledge. When people first begin noticing that certain ancient structures seem to line up with others far beyond their immediate region, the reaction is usually a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. It doesn't feel like something that should be possible, because the distances involved are so large and the cultures so separate in time and location. Yet the alignments appear again and again, sometimes along coastlines, sometimes across deserts, sometimes through mountains, and sometimes even over oceans. They don't always show up in perfect lines, and not every proposed connection holds up under closer examination, but enough examples exist that the idea becomes difficult to ignore. It's not that every alignment represents a deliberate system. Some may be coincidental, but the more you look, the more the pattern resembles something people noticed in their landscapes and expressed through the placement of their most important structures. A good starting point is the way certain monuments share similar orientations, even when they were built by cultures that had no knowledge of one another. Some temples face the rising sun at specific times of year. Others face the setting sun. Others align with particular star positions or paths traced across the sky. Because these astronomical features are visible to everyone on Earth, it makes sense that different cultures would notice them. Still, when you map the orientations of monuments across continents, a striking consistency appears. For example, many structures across Africa, the Mediterranean, the Americas, and Asia are oriented either to the cardinal directions or to key solar points. This creates lines that stretch over long distances, even if the builders never intended those lines to extend beyond their own region. It's important to understand how such alignments could form without any direct communication. When people observe the same sky every day of their lives, and when those observations guide rituals, calendars, and agriculture, it's natural that they would build structures that reflect what they see. The Earth's rotation and orbit create patterns that remain the same, regardless of where you live. That means builders in distant places might use the same reference points. If one group aligns a temple to the winter solstice sunrise, another group on the opposite side of the world may do the same because that sunrise marks a significant seasonal moment. The result is a shared pattern that can be mapped across continents. Another example involves alignments based on geography. Some ancient structures are positioned along natural corridors such as river valleys, mountain ridges, or coastlines. When these corridors follow long, predictable paths, they can form alignments that appear intentional on a global scale. For example, a series of structures built along a long mountain chain may end up creating a line that spans multiple regions. When viewed from above or on a map, the line becomes clear even if the builders never thought beyond their own stretch of the landscape. These natural features create paths that humans instinctively follow. Over long periods, repeated movement and construction along these paths produce visible alignments. There is also the question of ley lines, a term introduced much later in history, but often applied to ancient sites. While many claims about ley lines are exaggerated or oversimplified, the basic observation is that certain ancient sites appear to form straight lines when plotted on maps. These lines sometimes stretch surprisingly far, connecting structures that seem unrelated. The difficulty is determining which alignments are meaningful and which are the result of people drawing lines between points on a sphere where coincidences are common. However, even within cautious analysis, some alignments remain noteworthy. They involve structures that share similar purposes or similar astronomical orientations, suggesting that the alignments reflect shared human responses to the landscape, rather than a deliberate global grid. One example of such alignments can be found in the way some ancient cultures placed their structures along latitudinal or longitudinal bands. Certain monuments appear at similar latitudes, meaning they share the same relationship to the sun's path. This results in similar daylight patterns, similar seasonal movements, and similar shadows at certain times of year. Because of this, the builders in these regions were likely responding to similar environmental cues. When you place multiple structures along the same latitude on a map, the effect resembles a long line stretching across continents, even if the cultures had no contact. Another interesting pattern appears when you consider how ancient people used long-distance sight lines. In some regions, structures were placed where they could be seen from far away. A temple on a ridge might be visible from the next ridge over. A series of such placements could create a chain of visibility stretching across large areas. Over generations, communities might build new structures aligned with older ones, simply because those earlier structures became reference points. When this happens repeatedly, a loose but traceable alignment emerges. If researchers later extend those lines further on maps, they sometimes find other structures along the same path, not because of a deliberate plan, but because people in different regions were making decisions based on the visibility of their surroundings. The idea of global alignments also appears in discussions of how ancient people navigated long distances. Some cultures use the stars, the sun, and landmarks to travel across large regions. If travel routes remained stable for long periods, structures placed along those routes may show consistent orientations. Over time, the routes themselves become part of the pattern. When archaeologists uncover ancient paths or roads that connect clusters of structures, the alignments appear more deliberate. In some cases, these paths continue for hundreds of miles, connecting settlements, ceremonial centres, and trading hubs. When such routes are extended on maps, they sometimes intersect with other patterns on different continents, not because the routes were connected, but because ancient people used similar methods to orient themselves. There is also the matter of distances between major monuments. Some researchers have pointed out that certain distances repeat across cultures. For example, the distance between two significant sites in one region may match the distance between two sites elsewhere. These repeated distances might simply result from practical travel ranges. People may have built structures a certain number of days' journey apart because that's what made sense for trade or communication. If the average travel range for ancient people fell within a predictable limit, those distances might appear again in other regions where the same practical reasoning applied. When you look at all these factors together, astronomical orientations, geographic patterns, environmental cues, sight lines, travel distances, and repeated practical decisions, a broader picture forms. The alignment stretching across continents may not represent a deliberate global network in the modern sense. Instead, they reflect how people responded to shared conditions across the planet. The Earth offers a limited number of stable reference points, and ancient people made use of them. When builders in unrelated regions use the same reference points, their structures naturally create long-distance patterns. However, even if these patterns arise naturally, they still carry an element of mystery. The consistency is striking enough that it raises questions about how ancient people understood their world. Did they see themselves as part of a larger system? Did they recognize patterns that extended beyond their immediate environment? Did they develop methods of observation that made their alignments more accurate than we expect? The answers likely vary depending on the culture, but the patterns themselves suggest that people were paying close attention. Some alignments are more specific. For example, certain ancient structures line up with volcanic peaks that lie far beyond their region. Others align with large bodies of water that aren't visible from the immediate area. Some align with the rising or setting of stars that appear low on the horizon, requiring careful observation over long periods. These more precise alignments suggest intentional planning, yet when these precise alignments appear in multiple regions across the world, the question becomes not whether people were coordinating across continents, but whether they developed similar observational skills independently. One useful way to understand this is to imagine ancient people watching the sky without a modern clock or calendar. Their sense of time was shaped by natural cycles. They observed the length of shadows, the angle of the sun, the position of stars and the direction of winds. Over many years they would have noticed that certain astronomical events occur reliably. They would have learned to predict those events and build structures that recorded them. If many cultures observed the same events, their structures would naturally share similarities. Those similarities would create alignments that appear connected. Another factor is the role of ritual and symbolism. Many ancient structures were built for ceremonial or religious purposes. The builders often chose orientations that aligned with events they considered meaningful. If several cultures independently chose to honour the same astronomical moment, their structures would face the same direction. When plotted on a map, those structures might form a line. That line might stretch across continents, not because the builders communicated, but because the meaning of the sky was universal. Even practical needs can create long-distance patterns. For example, if an ancient community wanted their agricultural calendar to be accurate, they might build a structure aligned with the solar event. If another community elsewhere had the same need, they might do the same. Over time, the alignments would overlap. If enough structures align with the same event, the pattern becomes visible on a global scale. Travel also plays a role in understanding these alignments. While many ancient cultures were isolated, others travelled more than we often assume. Some travelled by sea, following coastlines or open water routes. Others moved across land, following seasonal migrations or trade paths. Knowledge may have travelled with those people. Techniques for aligning structures might have spread from one region to another. Even if only general ideas spread, the resulting structures could share enough features to create alignments. However, it's important to avoid assuming too much communication between distant cultures. Many alignments are best explained by shared human experiences rather than direct influence. People everywhere observe the sun and stars. People everywhere use the land to guide their decisions. People everywhere responded to the same natural patterns. When those responses create repeated choices, long-distance alignments become easier to understand. Still, there are some alignments that remain harder to explain. These involve structures placed at precise angles relative to points thousands of miles away. Some researchers propose mathematical models suggesting that ancient people may have had a broader understanding of geometry than we typically credit them with. Others argue that these alignments may be coincidental or reflect patterns created by choosing particular sets of data. Even when the alignments are unusual, it's important to look at them carefully without rushing to conclusions, because understanding their origin depends on understanding the context in which the structures were built. One thing is certain: the more you look at ancient monuments on a map, the more patterns appear. Some reflect astronomical cycles, others reflect geography, others reflect repeated human choices. Together, they create a global picture that feels more connected than expected. Not connected in the sense of a coordinated system, but connected in the sense that people across the world approach their environments with similar methods and priorities. This perspective changes the way we see the ancient world. Instead of imagining isolated cultures building in isolation, we begin to see them as part of a broader human response to the Earth itself. The alignments stretching across continents offer clues about how different societies viewed their place in the world. They reveal the importance of the sky, the landscape, and long-term observation. They show that people across the world shared a desire to anchor their lives to stable reference points, even when the ocean or mountains separated them. When exploring the alignments that stretch across continents, another question naturally follows, one that often goes unnoticed until you start looking at these structures more closely. If people in distant regions use similar reference points to place their monuments, did they also use similar internal layouts to shape them? This brings attention to something that becomes more noticeable the longer you study ancient architecture. Many of these structures contain patterns that go beyond simple practicality. They weren't just built to stand upright or survive bad weather. They were organised using principles of geometry that appear again and again in ways that suggest a deeper level of planning than is usually assumed. This geometry isn't hidden in the sense that it was deliberately concealed. It's hidden because it requires careful observation to see how consistently it emerges. What stands out first is the use of symmetry. Not just symmetry in the overall shape of a structure, but symmetry in the layout of rooms, courtyards, corridors, and open spaces. When you look at pyramids, temples, stone circles, or ceremonial centres and trace the layout from above, balanced arrangements appear repeatedly. They're not always perfect, and they don't always follow the same patterns, but the underlying idea is consistent. Builders wanted stability and order. Symmetry naturally provides this. It distributes weight evenly, makes navigation simpler, and offers a clear visual structure. Once a culture adopts symmetry in its architecture, it becomes easier for future builders to follow the same approach. Over time, these repeated patterns form a recognisable style that carries through generations. However, geometry in ancient structures goes beyond symmetry. Many monuments contain precise ratios built into their dimensions. These ratios appear not only in the height and width of structures, but in the spacing between stones, the distances between columns, the lengths of corridors, and the widths of doorways. These numbers aren't random. They're consistent in ways that suggest builders were using mathematical relationships as guidelines. Some cultures used whole number ratios because they were easy to replicate. Others used more complex proportions based on observations of nature. Even when the ratios differ between cultures, the idea of using geometry to create a sense of order remains universal. One of the most widespread geometric principles is the use of right angles. At first, this seems obvious. Right angles make construction easier. They simplify planning and help structures stay aligned. But the remarkable point is how early different cultures learned to create reliable right angles and how consistently they used them. In many ancient societies, right angles show up long before written mathematical systems are documented. Builders developed simple methods using ropes, stakes, and proportional measurements. These techniques allowed them to create rectangular layouts with surprising accuracy. Once a culture mastered this skill, it became a standard part of architecture. The consistent use of right angles becomes especially interesting when paired with something else found in ancient structures, diagonal geometry. Some monuments incorporate triangles and diagonal lines that reflect deliberate planning rather than random choices. For example, certain pyramids are designed so that their corners, when connected, form internal diagonals that link significant points of the structure. These diagonals often align with external features such as nearby hills or astronomical events. When viewed from above, the layout reveals geometric relationships that tie the internal structure to the surrounding landscape. This pattern appears in various regions, including Mesoamerica, Egypt, Southeast Asia, and parts of Europe. Another recurring geometric element is the use of circular forms. Circles appear in stone rings, plazas, ceremonial platforms, and burial mounds. At times, the circles are not perfectly round, but they still follow a clear geometric intention. The use of circles likely began for practical reasons. Circular shapes are structurally stable and easy to form using simple tools. But over time, circles also gained symbolic meaning for many cultures. They could represent cycles, groups, or gathering spaces. When circles appear repeatedly across different regions, it raises questions about how ancient people understood shape. Were they simply using a practical form, or did they see circles as a meaningful way to organize space? There are also examples of more complex geometry, including shapes that resemble polygons or combinations of squares and rectangles. These layouts often appear in places where the builders had advanced knowledge of their environment and access to skilled labour. Some temple complexes contain multiple connected courtyards arranged in precise patterns. Some ancient cities include street grids or modular layouts that reflect a clear understanding of proportion. These geometric systems may have developed independently in each region, but when viewed collectively they reveal a shared approach to shaping space. The consistent appearance of these patterns suggests a level of planning and coordination that early societies may have used more widely than we tend to assume. Many ancient builders used geometry to convey cultural or ritual significance. For example, some cultures oriented structures so that sunlight would fall in specific patterns during certain times of year. These patterns might have appeared as lines, angles, or shapes inside a space. When the geometry of the structure interacts with natural light in a predictable way, it points toward careful planning. Builders had to understand both the shape of the structure and the movement of the sun. This kind of planning required long-term observation and knowledge passed down over many generations. When similar techniques appear across continents, it raises questions about how much ancient cultures understood about the relationship between geometry and natural cycles. In some regions, the geometry goes even deeper. Certain monuments use proportions that appear to reflect mathematical constants. This doesn't necessarily mean those cultures knew those constants in a formal sense, but they might have discovered them through repeated measurement and observation. If a particular ratio created a stable structure or an appealing layout, builders might have continued using it without fully analysing the underlying mathematics. Over time, those proportions become part of the architectural tradition. When similar proportions appear in other regions, it may reflect a shared practical solution rather than a shared origin. There are also cases where the geometry seems linked to the broader landscape. For example, some structures are built in alignment with nearby mountains, rivers, or coastlines. The geometry of the structure mirrors or references the shape of the environment. This creates a relationship between the monument and the land that goes beyond simple placement. It suggests that the builders were thinking about how the structure fit into the larger context. When multiple cultures use similar methods to connect their structures to the landscape, it raises questions about whether they were responding to the same environmental cues or developing similar planning methods. Another interesting feature is the way some cultures use geometry to create scale. Certain monuments are designed with repeating shapes or proportions that increase or decrease in size. This creates a visual effect that guides the viewer's attention. It might draw the eye toward the center of a space, or toward an entrance, or toward the sky. This technique requires an understanding of how people perceive space. When similar forms of scaled geometry appear from different regions, it suggests that ancient builders were thinking carefully about how people would experience the inside of their monuments. In some cases, geometric planning can be seen in the placement of supporting structures around major monuments. For example, the arrangement of smaller buildings around a central pyramid or temple often follows patterns that reflect geometric principles. The supporting structures might form grids, circles, or clusters that repeat certain proportions. These repeated patterns show that the builders were not only focused on the main monument, but also on how the surrounding space contributed to its meaning or function. When similar arrangements appear across continents, it supports the idea that geometry played a foundational role in ancient planning. It's also worth noting that geometry in ancient structures often reflects the social or political organisation of the culture that built them. In some societies, geometric precision signalled order and authority. A ruler or priest might oversee the construction to ensure that the monument aligned with specific values or beliefs. In these cases, the geometry served not only a practical purpose, but also a symbolic one. When societies in distant regions use similar geometric forms to express stability, power, or unity, it suggests that geometry acted as a shared tool for communicating cultural ideals. As researchers analyse more ancient monuments with modern tools, such as satellite imaging and laser scanning, new geometric patterns continue to appear. Some structures contain hidden alignments that are difficult to see from the ground. Others contain proportions that were not obvious until high-resolution measurements became available. These discoveries reveal that ancient builders often included details that were meant to be understood only by those who studied the structure over time. When similar hidden relationships appear in monuments across continents, it raises questions about whether different cultures were using geometry as a way to encode knowledge. The fact that these geometric patterns continue to appear suggests that ancient builders were deeply engaged in long-term planning. Geometry helped them create stability, shape ceremonial spaces, and express important ideas. It also helped them connect their structures to the landscape and sky. When similar geometric approaches appear in distant cultures, it highlights the ways in which people around the world responded to their environment with similar methods, even without direct communication. While the specific techniques used by each culture differ, the consistent presence of geometry in their monuments reveals a shared understanding of space. Ancient builders recognized that geometric relationships could help them create structures that lasted, impressed, or conveyed meaning. They experimented with different shapes and proportions until they found methods that worked reliably. Over time, these methods became traditional, and future builders continued to use them. These patterns show that the idea of a hidden geometry in ancient monuments isn't about secret knowledge or coordinated planning across continents. It's about recognizing that people everywhere have a tendency to use certain shapes and proportions because they make sense, because they work, and because they express something consistent about how humans understand the world. Certain places on Earth feel connected in ways that don't depend on visible structures, clear geographical paths, or deliberate communication. This idea usually comes up when people notice that some monuments align along long distances, not only through shared geometry or astronomy, but through connections that seem to follow the landscape in ways that aren't immediately obvious. These connections are often described as energy lines or ley lines, concepts that blend historical placement with the ways people experience certain locations. While the term ley lines is relatively modern, the underlying observations behind it are much older. The modern idea began when researchers started marking ancient sites on maps and noticed that some of them formed straight lines. These lines sometimes connected old churches, standing stones, burial mounds, and hilltop fortifications in the same region. At first, this was treated as a curiosity. Many landscapes contain clusters of ancient sites, and it's natural that some might line up by chance. But as more maps were studied, more lines emerged. Not every proposed line was convincing, and some were likely the result of selecting points that fit a desired pattern. But the idea persisted because enough examples showed alignments that were difficult to dismiss outright. People began asking why these lines existed, and whether they represented something beyond geographical coincidence. To understand these ideas clearly, it helps to separate the modern interpretations from the ancient observations. Most ancient cultures did not leave written explanations describing long-distance energy pathways. They didn't use the term ley lines. However, many of them did treat certain locations as special. These places could be hills, springs, valleys, or plateaus. They often became settings for temples, sanctuaries, or structures that served ceremonial purposes. When you map such locations across a region and connect the points, lines appear whether or not the builders intended them. These lines often follow natural features such as ridge crests, river paths, or straight stretches of terrain. They also correlate with places that provided navigation advantages, visibility, or a sense of stability. The idea of energy lines comes into the discussion when people notice how these alignments feel when walking them. Many describe a sense of calm or clarity at certain sites. Others describe feeling energized or focused. Some notice changes in temperature, sound, or airflow. These impressions vary from one person to another, but they persist across many cultures that built monuments in similar locations. Even if the effects are subjective, they still raise questions about why ancient builders chose those sites. Perhaps the locations had environmental qualities that made them stand out. Springs, minerals, wind patterns, or geological features can shape how a place feels. If ancient people sensed something unusual or noteworthy in those locations, they might have built structures there intentionally. It's worth remembering that many ancient cultures relied closely on their immediate environment for survival. They paid attention to subtle differences in the landscape because these differences affected water sources, food availability, and weather patterns. When you live in close relationship with the land, certain places naturally become more important. A ridge that receives early light in winter might become a signal point for marking seasons. A spring that never dries might become a gathering place. A hilltop with consistent wind might become a site for ceremonies. If several such places align when plotted on a map, this can create the appearance of a path or grid. Another part of this idea comes from the way ancient people travelled. Many early routes followed direct lines across the landscape, especially in open terrain. These lines might connect settlements, markets, or seasonal meeting places. Over time, people added monuments along these routes either because they were convenient, because the location had symbolic value, or because the route was already well known. When such structures appear on a map centuries later, they form straight paths that resemble intentional alignments. Some early roads also followed astronomical alignments. For example, if people knew how to track the path of the sun or stars, they might build a road that pointed toward a specific sunrise or star position. Such roads appear in several ancient cultures. When those astronomical lines intersect with the placement of monuments, they create patterns that look like part of a larger network. These networks may not have been global in intention, but they reflect a way of viewing the landscape that relied on stable reference points. One interesting observation is that some of these alignments follow ancient boundaries or territories. In some regions, stone markers or monuments were placed at the edges of land claims. When these markers lined up, the effect resembled a long-distance alignment. These markers were practical tools rather than energy-related structures, but their placement contributes to the broader patterns seen today. They show how repeated decisions by generations of people can create lines across the land that appear more deliberate than they originally were. The idea of energy lines becomes more complex when considering how some ancient monuments seem to interact with geological features. In certain regions, structures appear along fault lines or areas with unusual magnetic properties. This may not have been intentional, but people might have sensed something distinct about these locations. Fault lines can create subtle shifts in the ground. Magnetic anomalies can alter compasses or affect how metal behaves. Springs often emerge near geological boundaries. When people notice that certain places have unusual natural properties, they may attribute significance to them. If several cultures build monuments in similar geological zones, the resulting patterns can look like lines on a map. Another aspect of this topic involves how ancient structures relate to water. Springs, underground streams, and rivers all create energetic movement in the landscape that ancient people relied upon. Water consistently appears as a factor in where monuments are placed. Even when the structures are built on high ground, they are often located near sources of water, or where water flows underground. When researchers map these water paths and compare them to the placement of monuments, connections appear that seem to follow natural lines in the earth. These paths might not be visible, but they shape how people move and where they settle. Over time, monuments built along such paths create long-distance patterns that resemble intentional alignments. Another detail to consider is how ancient people interpreted the land. Many cultures believed the Earth contained flows of energy or vital forces that shaped life and connected places of importance. While these beliefs differ from one culture to another, they suggest a shared recognition that certain parts of the landscape held more significance than others. Whether or not these forces were based on measurable physical properties, the belief in them influenced how communities built their monuments. If a culture believed a particular line of hills or a particular direction carried importance, they might build along it. Even if the belief took different forms in separate cultures, similar placements can occur if many communities responded to comparable features of their environment. Some modern interpretations of ley lines treat them as evidence of a global system of energy. These ideas often go beyond what archaeological evidence supports. However, the persistence of the concept shows how strongly people react to patterns in the landscape. People instinctively look for connections and meaning, and when they find alignments that stretch long distances, the mind naturally searches for explanations. While many alignments are likely the result of practical decisions, some may reflect deeper cultural understandings of the land. When studying these ideas carefully, it helps to focus on what ancient builders actually did rather than on later assumptions. They chose locations based on natural resources, visibility, stability, and environmental cues. They aligned their monuments to the sky, the land, and important seasonal markers. They placed structures along travel routes, boundaries, and waterways. When these choices are repeated across large regions, they create long-distance patterns that resemble networks. These patterns are part of how humans adapt to the world, even if the term energy line didn't exist at the time. Still, certain locations do seem to draw repeated attention across different cultures. Hills that rise above flat terrain, valleys that carry sound unusually well, springs that never run dry, and ridges that offer long views often become centres of activity. When multiple monuments appear in such places and align with one another, it creates a sense of connection. The land subtly encourages people to select these locations because they stand out, and the structures reinforce the importance of those spots. When you draw lines between these locations, patterns appear that combine environmental factors with human decisions. Another consideration is the role of memory. Once a place becomes important, people return to it over generations. They might build new structures near older ones, maintain pathways, or hold ceremonies. This repeated use strengthens the pattern. When several such important places align, the effect becomes clearer. Even if the alignment was never intended, it becomes part of how the land is shaped through human activity. Modern mapping tools reveal these patterns in ways that ancient people couldn't have seen. From the ground, a structure might appear isolated, but from above, it becomes part of a longer line. This perspective shift changes how we understand the past. It shows that the land contains relationships not easily seen at ground level, but that nonetheless reflect how people interacted with their environment. Whether these lines represent energy, memory, movement, or a combination of factors depends on how you interpret them. But their presence remains a noticeable part of the global pattern of ancient monuments. Some regions even show intersecting lines where multiple alignments meet. These intersections often occur at places that were significant for ancient cultures. They might have been trade centres, ceremonial hubs, or locations with natural resources. When different kinds of alignments converge in one spot, it suggests the site held multiple meanings. It might have served as a place where people observed the sky, gathered for rituals, or connected with other communities. These intersections create focal points in the landscape that stand out even today. Even though the concept of energy lines is modern, the underlying idea reflects something ancient cultures understood intuitively. They recognize that the land contains rhythms, cycles, and pathways shaped by natural forces. They adapted their lives and structures to those patterns. They built along lines created by geography, water, wind, and the sky. When seen as a whole, these choices create a network of connections that spans continents. The concept becomes clearer when you consider how many ancient people saw themselves as part of a larger system. They didn't separate the sky, the land, and human activity as we often do today. Instead, they saw these elements as connected. A structure placed in one location might relate to the position of the sun, the direction of the wind, or the shape of the terrain. Even if different cultures expressed these ideas in different ways, the consistent placement of monuments along certain lines reflects a shared understanding that the Earth itself contains patterns worth acknowledging. As these alignments accumulate, they create the impression of invisible pathways stretching across the landscape. They may not have been charted on ancient maps, but they show up through consistent choices. Whether the lines reflect travel, environment, ritual significance, or simple practicality, they create long-distance patterns that contribute to the larger idea of how ancient structures relate to one another. When looking at long-distance alignments and the subtle pathways people created across different landscapes, another question surfaces almost automatically. If ancient builders were making similar choices about placement, orientation, and geometry, why do so many of their structures also share recognizable architectural features, even when the cultures had no clear contact with one another? This observation appears in discussions about pyramids, stone circles, stepped platforms, massive pillars, underground chambers, and even certain building materials that repeat across continents. It often leads to speculation about shared origins or communication networks that are far beyond what is supported by direct evidence. But the puzzle becomes more interesting when approached slowly and carefully, without assuming either coincidence or direct influence too quickly. The first point that stands out is the repeated use of monumental stone construction. Many ancient civilizations relied on stone for their most significant structures. They shaped it, stacked it, carved it, and arranged it into lasting forms. While this isn't surprising on its own, what becomes compelling is how similar construction methods appear in places separated by oceans. Large stones fitted together with minimal gaps show up in regions as far apart as the Andes, the Mediterranean, parts of Asia, and parts of Africa. In some cases, the stones are irregular in shape, yet set so closely that a blade can't be inserted between them. In others, they follow precise rectangular patterns, laid out in courses that resist earthquakes or heavy pressure. These similarities raise questions about the problem-solving processes behind them. Stone construction naturally encourages certain solutions. Heavy blocks placed at angles provide stability. Interlocking shapes prevent sliding. Steps allow for steady upward building. Over many generations, builders discovered methods that worked and continue to use them. When multiple cultures face similar engineering challenges, they often develop similar strategies. For instance, the use of stepped designs appears in various places not because of shared plans, but because stepping prevents collapse and allows structures to grow taller without becoming unstable. Even so, the similarities can be surprisingly close. Consider the way some civilizations created elevated platforms for temples or ceremonial structures. These platforms appear in Mesoamerica, Southeast Asia, parts of the Middle East, and Africa. They weren't identical, and they served different cultural roles, but the idea behind them often aligned with similar needs. High platforms provided visibility, offered a sense of separation between sacred and everyday life, and protected important structures from flooding or erosion. When different cultures faced similar environmental and social conditions, they naturally adopted similar architectural forms. Another repeating feature is the use of large plazas or open spaces surrounded by structures. These open areas appear in ancient cities from different parts of the world. They served as gathering places, markets, or ceremonial centres. Their boundaries often consist of stepped pyramids, platforms, or rectangular buildings arranged in intentional patterns. The layout suggests a shared approach to organising community life, even if the cultures had no contact. Open central spaces help manage crowds, emphasise important buildings, and create locations for events. The same architectural logic can appear anywhere large communities gather. There is also the question of columns and pillars. Tall stone pillars rise in places as separated as Turkey, India, Ethiopia and North America. They vary in design and purpose, but they share the function of marking important spaces or supporting roofs. Columns allow for large covered areas without limiting interior movement. Pillars used as markers indicate boundaries, commemorate events, or support ritual spaces. When heavy roofing materials require strong vertical supports, the use of pillars appears almost automatically. Once a culture masters the vertical placement of stone, the architectural form becomes part of their toolkit, and similar structures appear elsewhere as a result. Shared architecture also appears in the use of burial mounds or elevated tombs. Mounds appear in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. They often contain internal chambers, stone-lined paths, or central burial rooms. The shape of a mound naturally protects what lies inside. It keeps rain from pooling, directs runoff down the sides, and provides insulation. When people wanted to preserve important individuals or sacred objects, building a mound offered a reliable method. This consistency reflects the physical advantages of the form more than any direct cultural connection. Another notable pattern involves the orientation of entrances. In many ancient structures, entrances face east. This is true in temples, tombs, pyramids, and ceremonial buildings across diverse regions. The reason often relates to the sunrise. Watching the sun rise can mark seasons, ceremonies, or important moments in the cultural calendar. Entrances that face east allow light to enter in predictable ways. Even when cultures had no contact, the sunrise provided a universal reference point that influenced architectural design. Some of the similarities become even more interesting when considering the use of underground or partially underground structures. Many civilizations created chambers, tunnels, or hidden rooms below the surface. These spaces appear in regions as distant as Scotland, Peru, India, China, and the Middle East. Underground construction offers benefits that apply regardless of the region. It provides cooler temperatures, protection from wind, and insulation from seasonal changes. It also offers privacy or separation for rituals, ceremonies, or storage. Whether used for burial, gathering, or safeguarding important items, underground spaces solve problems that many cultures faced. A repeated feature across multiple civilizations is the use of precise stone joints. In some regions, builders shape stones carefully to interlock without mortar. This technique appears in South America, Egypt, parts of the Mediterranean, and parts of Asia. It suggests that ancient builders understood how to maximize stability by fitting stones closely together. Such joints distribute weight evenly and resist shifting during earthquakes. Cultures that experience regular ground movement may have independently developed these techniques. The fact that they show up in multiple regions suggests that different societies arrived at similar engineering solutions. When analysing shared architecture, it's also important to consider how certain tools and materials influence building methods. For example, if a culture had access to a particular type of stone that broke in predictable patterns, they might shape it into blocks or slabs. Another culture with access to a similar type of stone might do the same. The material itself guides the form. The same applies to tools. Stone hammers, wooden levers, and simple measuring tools lead to certain architectural techniques. Even if different cultures develop their tools independently, the resulting forms often look similar because the tools enable similar outcomes. Another aspect of shared architecture relates to the way people organize their cities. Many ancient cities include grid-like street patterns. This appears in regions such as the Indus Valley, ancient China, and parts of Mesoamerica. A grid pattern makes navigation easier and allows for predictable expansion. It simplifies the layout of housing, markets, and ceremonial centres. When a culture grows large enough to require organised planning, a grid naturally becomes an attractive option. Even if two cultures never communicated, their urban layouts can look similar because they're responding to the same challenges of managing population and movement. In some civilizations, the repetition of architectural forms reflects cultural beliefs. If a structure had symbolic meaning, builders would repeat its form even when constructing different types of buildings. Over generations, these symbolic forms become architectural signatures. When researchers later compare signatures from different parts of the world, the similarities can appear significant. Some might suggest shared origins, but the similarities often reflect universal human tendencies. People everywhere use symbols to convey identity, meaning, and tradition. When certain shapes become culturally important, they influence the design of many structures within that culture. There is also the practical aspect of defending territory or community. Many ancient civilizations built walls, fortresses, or defensive platforms with similar features. High walls, narrow entrances, elevated vantage points, and thick stone bases appear in defensive structures worldwide. These features reflect universal strategies for protecting settlements. Over time, similar construction appears in distant cultures because any community facing threats would naturally learn to build in ways that increase protection. Shared architecture also reflects the influence of climate. In hot, dry regions, thick stone walls and small openings help keep interior spaces cool. In cold regions, underground chambers or insulated walls help retain heat. In rainy regions, angled roofs or elevated foundations prevent water damage. When cultures adapt to similar climates, architects use similar solutions. Over time, these solutions become part of the architectural tradition. When comparing structures across similar climates but distant locations, the similarities can be striking, even if the cultures never communicated. As architectural techniques improved, some civilizations began experimenting with acoustics. They discovered that certain shapes and materials amplify sound or create specific auditory effects. Circular structures, angled walls and enclosed chambers can alter sound in predictable ways. These techniques appear in ceremonial structures across multiple regions. People use them to enhance rituals, speeches, or performances. Even without sharing knowledge, cultures discovered similar ways to use sound because the underlying physics remains the same everywhere. Another interesting observation involves the use of processional pathways. Many ancient sites include long straight paths leading to important buildings. These paths appear in Egypt, Mesoamerica, parts of Europe, and parts of Asia. They serve practical and symbolic purposes. They guide people towards significant locations and emphasize the importance of what lies ahead. Straight paths also simplify movement and create predictable visual lines. When multiple cultures use straight ceremonial routes, it reflects a shared understanding of how to manage gatherings and convey importance. One of the most debated similarities involves pyramid-like structures. These structures appear in Egypt, Mesoamerica, China, Sudan, and parts of Southeast Asia. The similarities can be surprising at first, but the underlying reasons behind them often reflect the limitations and advantages of large-scale stone or brick building. Pyramids provide a stable way to build upward. The wider base supports the narrower top. Steps or tiers allow workers to access different levels during construction. Pyramids also resist weather and erosion. When different cultures aim to build tall or monumental structures, the pyramidal form emerged naturally. Over time, it gained symbolic importance in many regions. The similarities across continents may reflect shared practical decisions rather than direct cultural links. Shared architecture also appears in the way some civilizations designed their temples. Many include multiple tiers, narrow staircases, and elevated platforms. These features emphasize progression from one space to another. They create a sense of approaching something significant. Similar designs appear because they guide human movement effectively. When a culture wants to structure ceremonies in a particular way, architecture becomes a tool that shapes how people gather, move, and participate. It's possible that some architectural ideas did travel between regions through traders, travelers, or migrating groups. Knowledge doesn't need to cross oceans to spread. It can move slowly through generations of contact between neighbouring cultures. But even without such contact, many architectural solutions arise independently because people everywhere face similar challenges when building stable, meaningful, and lasting structures. The puzzle becomes more compelling when seeing how these shared architectural forms contribute to the larger patterns already discussed. Geometry, alignments, placement, and structural solutions all interact with each other. When multiple cultures adopt similar strategies in each area, the effects accumulate. Structures that appear connected across continents may reflect layers of shared human reasoning rather than a single origin. The more carefully you analyse these similarities, the more they show how ancient people used observation, experimentation, and tradition to shape their world. As the similarities in architecture, geometry, and long-distance alignments become clearer, another layer of the picture starts to form, one that centres not just on what people built, but why they chose certain locations with such consistency. Many ancient structures appear in places that feel naturally distinct, even today. These places draw attention without needing explanation. When people visit them, whether they're hills, plateaus, riverbanks, ridges, or open plains framed by mountains, they often describe a sense of significance that has little to do with the structures themselves and everything to do with the landscape. This raises an important question. Did ancient builders choose these sites because of practical needs alone, or because they sensed something about the land that made those locations the best choices for their most meaningful structures? To explore this, it helps to look at how many ancient cultures interpreted their surroundings. In times before modern technology, the landscape wasn't just scenery, it was a source of survival, orientation, food, and cultural identity. People observed it closely. They noticed where winds were strongest, where water flowed, where animals migrated, where the soil was richest, and where the sky seemed clearest at night. Over generations, certain places revealed themselves as more reliable, more striking, or more symbolic. These places became centres of activity. Communities built their first shelters nearby, held their first ceremonies there, and told their first stories rooted in those spaces. When looking at ancient sites through this lens, it becomes easier to understand why so many of them cluster in locations that appear meaningful even without the structures. In many cases, the land itself shaped the choices. A hill that receives the year's first morning light becomes a natural point for marking seasonal change. A spring that never runs dry supports community growth and becomes a gathering place. A plateau with a wide view of the horizon becomes a natural observatory. A valley with unusual acoustics may naturally become a meeting place. These features attract attention across cultures because they address needs and perceptions that humans share regardless of where they live. Another aspect of this involves how ancient builders understood the relationship between the land and the sky. Many sacred sites offer expansive views of sunrise, sunset, or specific star positions. They sit at angles where light moves across the ground in predictable ways. They occupy positions where shadows fall in long, steady lines at certain times of year. These features aren't accidental. People selected locations that allowed them to track natural cycles. A structure built in such a place gains functionality because the site itself carries information about time, seasons, and environmental patterns. Some sacred sites also coincide with unusual geological features. For example, many appear near fault lines, mineral deposits, magnetic anomalies, or areas with unusual acoustic properties. These environmental characteristics may have influenced how ancient people experienced the location. A place where the ground vibrates slightly due to geological activity might feel different. A location with strong natural echoes may amplify voices in ways that seem striking. A region with high concentrations of certain minerals might affect water quality or soil conditions. Even if ancient people didn't understand the geological mechanisms behind these features, they would have felt their effects. When several cultures built in locations with similar natural qualities, It suggests that people noticed these features and responded to them. Water plays a major role in many sacred landscapes. Springs, rivers, and lakes often appear near ancient structures. Water supports settlement, but it also holds cultural meaning. Some communities viewed springs as symbols of renewal, others associated rivers with movement or life. Still others used lakes as ceremonial boundaries. Water's presence shapes the land in ways that people can sense. The consistent appearance of sacred sites near water suggests that ancient builders recognized the importance of these features and built near them for both practical and symbolic reasons. In some regions, sacred sites appear at points where different landscapes meet. For example, where mountains meet plains, where rivers meet oceans, or where deserts meet fertile valleys. These transitions create locations with environmental diversity. They support varied plant and animal life. They offer wide perspectives for observing the sky. They create natural routes for travel. When sacred sites appear consistently at these boundary zones, it suggests that ancient people recognized the significance of these transition points. They may have seen them as places where different elements of the world came together, providing stability, opportunity, or symbolism. Another element in this discussion involves how ancient people navigated their surroundings. Without modern tools, they relied on visible landmarks, water flows, star paths, and wind patterns. Sacred sites built on ridgelines or hilltops often served as orientation points. They could be seen from long distances, helping travellers navigate. Over generations, these sites became embedded in the landscape as reference markers. When multiple cultures use similar methods to navigate and select their sites, the resulting patterns appear surprisingly consistent even across continents. When examining the silent language of the landscape, it's helpful to consider how many ancient cultures believed the land had a presence or character of its own. They didn't separate themselves from their environment in the way modern societies often do. Instead, they saw themselves as part of the land, influenced by its rhythms and shapes. This worldview encouraged people to choose locations that felt balanced, stable, or meaningful. If a place offered a sense of calm or focus, it became a natural choice for ceremonies. If the land formed a protective shape around a valley, the community might build there for security. When this perspective appears across cultures, the patterns become part of a shared human relationship with the earth. There is also the influence of oral traditions. Stories passed down through generations often describe places as special, not because of structures, but because of events, experiences, or ancestral connections. These stories guide communities towards certain parts of the landscape. When stories describe a hill as the place where the first seeds were planted, a temple might be built there later. When a cave is associated with early gathering, it might eventually become a sacred sanctuary. These inherited stories shape building decisions, and because human experiences with the landscape share common themes, similar stories guide similar architectural choices across continents. Some sacred sites appear near natural features that create recurring events. For example, locations where sunlight enters a cave only at certain times of year, or where water floods through a channel during specific seasons. These predictable events would have made the location striking and memorable. People might have gathered there to observe or celebrate these moments. Over generations, structures were added to emphasize or track the events. When similar natural events occur in landscapes across the world, and people respond by building monuments at those spots, the outcome becomes a repeated pattern of sacred architecture tied to natural rhythms. Another detail that becomes clear when studying ancient sites is how builders often integrated their structures with the land rather than forcing the land to accommodate their plans. In many places, temples, mounds, or platforms follow the contours of hills, ridges, or slopes. Builders worked with the existing shapes instead of flattening them. This approach keeps the structure connected to its environment. It also reflects an understanding of stability. Building along a ridge distributes weight in predictable ways. Constructing terraces along a slope prevents erosion. When cultures in different regions adopt similar techniques for working with the land, it shows that they recognize the same benefits. In some cultures, sacred sites reflect the movement of animals. Migratory paths, seasonal grazing grounds, and hunting routes influenced where communities built their structures. People relied on these animals for food, clothing, or materials. They observed where the animals travelled and built near those routes to ensure sustainable access. Over time, these locations gained cultural importance. When societies that depended on animal migration selected similar types of locations for their sacred or ceremonial structures, the patterns become part of a shared architectural logic shaped by ecological relationships. There is also the influence of sound. Many ancient sites exhibit unusual acoustic properties. Some amplify whispers, others carry sound evenly across large spaces, others create echoes that return in distinct patterns. These acoustic effects occur naturally when the land forms certain shapes. Ancient people noticed them and used them for gatherings, performances, or communication. If a hill produces a clear resonance, people might gather there for rituals. If a valley creates a unified sound, a structure might be built there to take advantage of that effect. When cultures across the world discovered similar acoustic phenomena in their landscapes, the sacred sites they built reflect that shared experience. Visual perspective also plays a major role. Ancient builders often chose locations with clear lines of sight. These lines of sight might stretch across long distances, allowing people to observe the movement of the sun, moon, or stars. They also might connect one sacred site to another. When you stand at some ancient monuments, you can see hills, rivers, or other structures lined up from horizon to horizon. These visual alignments suggest that builders selected sites based on how well they connected with the broader landscape. When multiple cultures use similar methods for selecting visually prominent or interconnected sites, the results appear remarkably consistent. Another principle that appears across sacred landscapes is the idea of centrality. Many ancient communities built their most important structures at the centre of a region, where they served as focal points for social, ceremonial, or administrative life. These central sites often occupy places where multiple paths naturally converge. This convergence might result from natural features like rivers or valleys, or from human-made routes used for travel or trade. When cultures in different regions build their important structures at these central points, the landscape itself becomes a guiding force that shapes architectural decisions. Some sacred sites also align with the way light moves through the land. For instance, locations where sunlight strikes a particular rock or hill in a distinctive way at sunrise or sunset. These effects might occur only at certain times of year. Ancient people who observed cycles closely would have noticed these events. Over time, they might interpret the effect as meaningful and choose to build near that location. Because the movement of light follows universal patterns, similar effects occur in many parts of the world. When communities in different regions respond to these effects in similar ways, the pattern becomes more visible. Another shared aspect of sacred landscapes involves the presence of rare or unique features. For example, rock formations that stand out sharply from their surroundings, natural arches, unusually shaped hills, or geological formations that appear isolated. These features attract attention because they differ from everything around them. People often interpret uniqueness as significance. If a location contains a rock formation that looks like nothing else in the region, it stands out as a natural landmark. Over time, it may become a ceremonial place. When similar features appear in other regions and attract similar responses from different cultures, the pattern becomes part of the global picture of sacred architecture. As these observations accumulate, it becomes clear that sacred sites across different cultures share more than just structural similarities. They reflect a consistent way of reading the landscape. Ancient people saw meaning in the land's shapes, sounds, movements, and cycles. They responded by building their most important structures in places where those features were most noticeable. Because the Earth offers similar features in many regions, the patterns that emerge reflect the shared human experience of living within a dynamic environment. These shared interpretations of the land created a framework that influenced where and how ancient people built their monuments. The more these patterns appear, the more they reveal about how different cultures understood their surroundings. Across many ancient cultures, stories often served as the earliest form of mapping. These stories were not always recorded in writing, yet they carried information about how people understood their world, what places mattered, and which journeys shaped their identity. When studying ancient structures and the landscapes they occupy, it becomes unavoidable to notice that myths and oral traditions often point toward the same locations where significant monuments stand. This overlap suggests that memory played a role in guiding architectural choices. The stories people told about the land preserved knowledge that influenced where they built, how they travelled, and how they interpreted the connections between distant places. One of the first things to recognise is that myths often describe journeys. Heroes, ancestors, spirits, or legendary travellers move through the world in patterns that mirror real routes. These stories give meaning to travel paths, marking them as important not only for physical reasons but also for cultural ones. When similar types of stories appear across distant civilizations, it raises questions about the origin of these repeated themes. Did the stories arise independently because people everywhere needed ways to explain their surroundings, or did some ideas travel farther than we assume? When looking at myths closely, certain elements appear repeatedly. Many cultures describe a high place where the world began or where important events occurred. Others describe a sacred river that guided early people. Still others mention mountains, stones, or specific directions that mattered deeply. These recurring elements don't necessarily indicate direct communication between cultures, but they do reflect consistent ways humans respond to their environment. A high mountain draws attention because it stands out on the horizon. A river becomes a natural path for travel and settlement. A cave invites interpretation because it represents shelter and depth. When these features appear in stories, they become part of a shared language of the land. Maps, in the ancient sense, often began as stories. People described routes, distances, and landmarks through narrative rather than drawings. Over time, as writing systems developed, these narrative maps became more defined, but the underlying structure remained tied to oral memory. The earliest drawn maps often highlight rivers, coastlines, or mountains, the same features emphasized in myths. When ancient maps from different cultures highlight similar features, it shows how people recognize the same landscape components as fundamental. Some myths describe connections that stretch surprisingly far. For example, stories about great migrations appear in cultures across Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. While each story is different, the theme of movement repeats. People describe journeys toward water, toward mountains, toward new lands, or back to ancestral homes. These stories may reflect actual migrations or seasonal movements. Over generations, they become part of cultural memory, shaping how people navigate and where they build their structures. When similar stories appear across continents, they suggest that movement itself shaped human understanding of the world. Another significant point is that myths often describe events tied to the sky. Eclipses, comets, solstices, and star patterns appear in stories from many cultures. These events influenced architecture by guiding alignments and orientations. When people told stories about a particular star or constellation, the story helped future generations remember when and where the star appeared. Over time, these stories influence where people built temples or observatories. When similar astronomical myths appear across distant regions, it hints at how shared observation of the sky shaped cultural memory. Some myths also describe catastrophic events such as floods, fires, or long periods of darkness. These stories appear in many civilizations and often guide the placement of sacred spaces. For example, a community that experienced a major flood might build sacred structures on higher ground. Another community might interpret volcanic activity as a sign of significance and build near certain mountains. Over time, these choices form patterns that appear across continents. The stories serve as a record of environmental changes, and the monuments built in response become part of the landscape's long-term memory. Maps made by ancient cultures reveal another layer of forgotten connections. Many early maps focus on symbolic importance rather than scale. They highlight the centre of the world as perceived by the community, surround it with significant locations, and place less familiar areas farther away. When comparing early maps from different cultures, some surprising similarities appear. They often place sacred mountains, rivers, or winds in comparable positions relative to the centre. Even though each culture created its own worldview, the structure of these symbolic maps reflects shared ways humans make sense of place. Memory also plays a role in how ancient people perceived distances. Without modern measuring tools, people relied on landmarks and stories to gauge how far one place was from another. A journey might be measured in days rather than miles. A mountain might be described as where the sun touches first, or where the wind begins. These descriptions create mental maps that shape how communities relate to their surroundings. When similar descriptive methods appear across cultures, it suggests that humans share common ways of interpreting distance and direction. Some myths appear to encode environmental knowledge. Stories about specific trees, animals, or geological formations often reflect practical information about resources or dangers. These stories guide people towards safe places to settle or favourable areas for building. Over time, these locations become sacred sites or ceremonial centres because they hold long-term meaning. When multiple cultures use stories to encode similar types of information, the resulting patterns of settlement and architecture can appear connected, even if the stories developed independently. Another area where myths influence architecture is in the concept of boundaries. Many cultures described borders between the human world and other realms, the sky, the underworld, or the ancestral realm. These boundaries often correspond to physical features such as caves, cliffs, horizons, or bodies of water. When a place was seen as a boundary, it frequently became a site for rituals or monuments. These boundary sites appear in many parts of the world. Their repeated use reflects how myths guided people towards specific locations that felt transitional or liminal. Certain myths describe journeys to the beginning of time or to ancestral origins. These stories often mention specific landscapes, mountains rising above clouds, rivers flowing from hidden springs, or distant lands where important events took place. When communities believed their ancestors came from a particular direction or region, they sometimes built monuments pointing toward that direction. Orientation became a way of preserving the memory of origin. When similar orientation patterns appear in distant cultures, it suggests that origin stories influenced architecture in predictable ways. The idea of forgotten connections emerges when noticing how these patterns accumulate. Even if cultures developed independently, the land itself shaped their stories, and the stories shaped their structures. Over time, the structures preserve the memory of the stories even after the stories change or fade. When researchers find similar structures in distant places, the connection may lie not in direct contact, but in shared human experiences recorded in myths. One example involves flood stories. Many cultures describe a great flood that changed the world. These stories appear in Mesopotamia, South Asia, China, parts of Africa, the Pacific Islands, and the Americas. While the details differ, the theme of catastrophic water reshaping life is consistent. If communities experience significant flooding events in their regions, the stories would reflect that. If the stories describe the need to build higher or seek safer ground, architecture would reflect those priorities. Over time, elevated structures, mounds, or hardened foundations would appear across multiple cultures. These shared architectural solutions might seem connected, but they may instead reflect shared memory of environmental events. Similarly, stories about sky gods or star beings may reflect the importance of the night sky for navigation and timekeeping. When people built structures aligned with the stars described in their myths, the architecture became physical reminders of the stories. When distant cultures told stories about similar stars or used the same constellations to guide decisions, the architecture also reflected those similarities. Over centuries, the structures remain even if the original interpretations shift. Some myths preserve memories of long-distance travel. For example, stories about people crossing large bodies of water appear in various cultures. These stories may describe actual journeys or symbolic transitions. If a community believed their ancestors arrived by sea, they might build monuments near coastlines or align structures toward the ocean. When multiple coastal cultures show similar architectural choices, it suggests that memory influenced placement more than contact. The sea becomes a shared element in the landscape, shaping how people interpret their origins. Another example involves mountains described as sacred pillars or as points where the sky and earth meet. Many cultures assign special significance to mountains because of their height, visibility, and prominence. When people tell stories about mountains as places where gods reside or where significant events occurred, they often build near or facing those mountains. This creates a pattern where sacred sites align with prominent peaks. When similar mountain-related myths appear elsewhere, the architectural patterns follow. In some cultures, maps were created not on paper, but through performance or ritual. A dance might trace the path of a river. A song might describe a journey across plains. A ceremony might reenact a migration. These embodied maps preserve detailed knowledge of the land. Over time, they guide where people build structures or hold ceremonies. When similar forms of embodied mapping appear across different continents, it reflects the human need to preserve spatial knowledge through memory. Another element involves how myths preserve the memory of older structures. A ruin might become the subject of new stories, even if its original purpose is forgotten. These stories then guide how future generations interact with the site. If a community believes a ruin marks a place of ancient activity, they might build near it or incorporate it into new structures. When similar reinterpretations occur across cultures, the process becomes another shared pattern of how people relate to the past. Ancient maps sometimes incorporate symbolic pathways that connect sacred sites. These pathways might not represent literal routes, but rather conceptual links between important places. When these paths appear in drawn maps, they resemble networks. If multiple cultures create similar symbolic networks, the structures built at these locations may appear connected across vast distances. This conceptual mapping becomes part of how people interpret their world, shaping the placement of monuments. Memory also influences how people name places. Certain names appear repeatedly across distant regions, often because they describe similar features. Names for high places, sacred springs, sunlit ridges, or places of origin may appear in different languages but carry comparable meanings. When place names reflect similar concepts, the structures associated with them often reflect similar purposes. Myths can also preserve the memory of trade or migration routes that later disappear. When people move away from an area, or when a route becomes less important, the stories about those paths may linger even after the physical traces fade. Later generations may build monuments along those remembered routes without fully understanding their original significance. When similar forgotten routes exist across continents, the structures built along them create patterns that appear connected. What stands out most is how memory interacts with the landscape. Myths describe places of importance, maps record them, architecture reinforces them. Over time, these processes create a layered relationship between humans and their environment. Even if cultures never communicated, they responded to their surroundings in consistent ways. Their stories guided their choices, and those choices left physical traces. When comparing these traces across continents, they form patterns that appear surprisingly cohesive. These patterns don't require a single explanation. They reflect the way humans interpret the world through story and memory. The land shapes the stories shape the maps, and the maps shape the monuments. This cycle appears across many civilizations. Modern research methods have changed how people study ancient structures, making it possible to identify patterns that earlier generations could only guess at. With satellite imagery, precise measurements, digital mapping, and advanced modelling tools, alignments that once seemed too subtle to notice have become clearer. This technological shift has allowed researchers to revisit ideas that were previously dismissed as coincidence or speculation. Instead of relying solely on field observations, scientists can now examine landscapes from above, analyse distances with high accuracy, and compare sites across continents with a level of detail that wasn't available before. This change doesn't provide simple answers, but it does open up new questions about why different cultures placed their monuments where they did and how they understood their surroundings. One of the most notable developments comes from the ability to map large regions at once. In the past, archaeological studies often focused on single sites or small clusters of structures. Now researchers can examine entire regions simultaneously, revealing long-distance connections that might not have been apparent from the ground. When plotting the orientation of multiple sites across thousands of miles, certain patterns emerge that challenge older assumptions. Some alignments follow directions closely tied to solar movement. Others appear to track long-distance geological features such as mountain chains or fault lines, and while many alignments still fall within the realm of coincidence, the sheer number of consistent directions raises the possibility that ancient builders might have noticed broader patterns in their environments. Another important development involves the analysis of scale. Modern tools allow researchers to measure distances between structures with great accuracy. In some regions, the distances between major sites repeat with surprising consistency. These repeated measurements may reflect the practical travel ranges of ancient people. If communities place settlements or ceremonial structures a certain number of days' journey apart, similar distances might appear across different regions. Scientists studying these patterns have found that natural rhythms played a role. Rivers, valleys, and coastal routes shape how people move, and over long periods, these repeated movements create spatial patterns that become embedded in cultural memory. When similar forms of spacing appear on different continents, the similarities suggest shared responses to the landscape rather than direct communication. Astronomers have also contributed to this discussion by examining how ancient structures align with celestial events. Many monuments around the world point toward the rising or setting sun during solstices or equinoxes. Others face specific stars or constellations that were important to the communities who observed them. With modern programs that simulate ancient skies, researchers can reconstruct what the sky looked like thousands of years ago and determine whether alignments were intentional or accidental. These simulations reveal that the builders in many cultures understood astronomical cycles with remarkable accuracy. Even without written records, the alignments embedded in the structures show that people observed the sky consistently over long periods. Yet, when similar astronomical alignments appear in distant regions, it becomes easy to jump to conclusions about direct connections. However, when scientists analyze these alignments carefully, they often find straightforward explanations. People everywhere watch the sky because it directly affected their lives. The timing of seasons guided planting and harvesting. The movement of stars helped with navigation. The solstices marked extremes of daylight that were easy to track. When people needed stable reference points, the sky provided them. As a result, alignments toward the same astronomical events can appear across continents without requiring any shared plan. Another scientific tool that adds depth to this topic is geological analysis. When researchers examine the placement of ancient monuments relative to underlying rock formations, soil types, and tectonic boundaries, patterns emerge that may not have been intentional but still influenced where people built. Some structures appear along fault lines because those regions often provide springs, fertile soil, or distinct landscapes that draw settlement. Others appear on volcanic rock that offers stable foundations. When similar geological conditions occur in different parts of the world, they produce similar settlement patterns. Over time, the monuments built in these consistent environments create alignments that appear meaningful, even if they were shaped by practical considerations. Magnetometry and other geophysical tools have also contributed to the understanding of ancient structures. These methods allow researchers to detect differences in magnetic fields and underground features. In some regions, ancient builders placed their structures in locations with unusual magnetic properties. While there is no evidence that ancient people understood magnetic fields in the way modern scientists do, they may have noticed subtle environmental cues such as changes in how tools behaved, temperature variations, or the behaviour of animals. These subtle cues might have influenced where people built. When similar patterns appear in distant regions, the idea of a global network emerges again, but the explanation often lies in shared sensitivity to environmental conditions. Remote sensing has revealed another layer of complexity. Many ancient structures are connected by paths or roads that are no longer visible on the surface. These hidden routes often align with natural features such as ridges, valleys, or water flows. In some regions, the paths form straight lines that extend for miles. These lines may have been used for ceremonial processions, trade, or seasonal migrations. When similar pathways appear across continents, they reflect consistent ways that ancient people moved through their landscapes. Scientists studying these patterns have found that natural efficiency often drives these routes. People follow the easiest paths, and those paths create predictable alignments. Archaeologists have also examined how ancient people used repeated units of measurement. Some civilizations use standardized lengths to build their structures. These units often reflect the length of a step, the span of an arm, or other body-based measures. When different cultures use body-based measurements, similarities can appear across their structures. This can create the illusion of shared systems, even when each culture developed its measurements independently. When scientists analyze architectural dimensions across regions, they often find proportional relationships that emerge naturally from using the human body as a reference. The development of statistical modelling has allowed researchers to test whether alignments occur by chance or reflect intentional design. These models compare the number of observed alignments to the number expected in random distributions. In many cases, the results show that some alignments are likely intentional, while others are coincidental. This balance between intention and chance highlights how complex the topic is. Even when a pattern appears strong, it may not reflect a deliberate plan. Conversely, some patterns that seem weak on the surface may represent subtle decisions by ancient builders. Scientists approach these questions carefully, looking for combinations of cultural, environmental, and practical factors that explain why certain structures align. Cognitive science adds another important piece to the discussion. Human perception naturally seeks patterns. This ability helps people recognize danger, navigate landscapes, and make predictions. When studying ancient structures, researchers must account for this tendency. The human mind is adept at connecting points into lines, even when no actual connection exists. Understanding this bias helps scientists distinguish between meaningful patterns and those that arise from interpretation alone. However, the presence of bias doesn't dismiss the possibility of real patterns. It simply encourages careful evaluation. Another contribution from scientific analysis comes from studying how ancient people transported large stones. Moving heavy materials over long distances requires knowledge of physics, group coordination, and environmental awareness. When scientists study the methods used by different cultures, they often find that people solved similar problems in similar ways. Logs, sledges, ropes, and friction reduction techniques appear across multiple regions. These shared engineering solutions don't indicate shared origin, but reflect practical responses to similar challenges. The ability to transport heavy stones allowed ancient builders to choose specific locations for their structures, contributing to long-distance patterns. Climate science offers another perspective. Shifts in climate over thousands of years influenced where people lived and how they built. Periods of increased rainfall or drought shape settlement patterns. When climates changed, communities moved to regions with better resources. These movements affected the placement of monuments. Over long periods, climate-driven relocations create layers of structures that relate to one another spatially. When similar climate shifts occurred in different parts of the world, they shaped parallel patterns of settlement and construction. Comparative anthropology also reveals similarities in how cultures organize space. Many societies developed central ceremonial hubs surrounded by smaller settlements or agricultural areas. These layouts reflect shared social needs. When scientists compare these patterns across continents, they find consistent arrangements that suggest similar social structures rather than direct communication. Architecture becomes a physical expression of how people interact, gather, and distribute resources. The intersection of science and ancient architecture becomes particularly intriguing when considering how knowledge spreads. Scientific research shows that information can move through indirect channels. Trade networks, migration routes, and shared environmental experiences can transmit ideas without direct communication between distant cultures. A technique developed in one area might travel gradually through neighbouring groups, eventually reaching faraway regions. This slow diffusion can create similarities across continents without requiring contact between the original cultures. Scientific tools have also revealed how erosion, vegetation growth, and natural changes have hidden or altered structures over time. Some alignments that were once clear may now be obscured. Conversely, some alignments that appear today may not have existed in the same form when the structures were built. This complicates interpretation, but also shows how dynamic landscapes interact with ancient architecture. When researchers account for these changes, they can better understand the intentions behind the placements. The involvement of multiple scientific fields demonstrates that ancient alignments result from a complex combination of factors. Some alignments reflect deliberate astronomical observations, others emerge from practical considerations such as movement, visibility, or resource availability. Others arise from environmental patterns that shaped how people lived. When similar circumstances occur across continents, the resulting patterns may appear connected even when they stem from independent decisions. People have always tried to make sense of their surroundings, and one of the most consistent ways they've done this is by searching for patterns. Whether looking at the shape of hills, the path of rivers, or the position of stars, humans tend to interpret the world through repeated forms. This tendency isn't limited to any single culture. It appears in communities separated by oceans and thousands of years. As soon as people began observing the land closely, they started noticing relationships between natural features, the seasons, and the places where they built their homes or monuments. This habit of recognizing structure in the environment helped early people navigate, survive, and create meaning. When studying ancient sites today, it becomes clear that this instinct shaped where structures were built, how they were oriented, and why certain places became important. Understanding why the mind seeks patterns is important when exploring why so many ancient monuments appear connected. The human brain evolved to detect relationships in the world because recognizing patterns was essential. If early people saw consistent signs that an area produced food, they returned there. If they noticed the stars repeated their paths, they used them for navigation. If they observed that certain winds brought seasonal changes, they prepared accordingly. These recognitions weren't abstract or symbolic. They were grounded in daily experience. Over thousands of years, this instinctive search for order helped people shape their world deliberately, even if they weren't always conscious of the full implications of their choices. When this tendency is applied to architecture and sacred landscapes, it becomes easier to see why ancient structures share so many features. Builders observed their environment carefully. They saw how shadows changed during the day. They noticed how rivers carved paths through valleys. They recognized how hills framed the horizon. When they built monuments, they incorporated these observations. The result is a collection of structures across the globe that reflect similar responses to the patterns found in nature. Another aspect of this topic involves how humans remember information. Stories, rituals, and structures all served as methods for preserving knowledge long before writing became common. When a community built a monument aligned with the sunrise at a certain time of year, that monument acted as a memory device. It recorded the pattern in a physical form. Future generations didn't need to memorize every detail, because the structure did part of the remembering for them. This process created a shared sense of continuity. When many cultures relied on physical structures to record patterns, similarities in the land led to similarities in the architecture. Over time, these structures form large-scale patterns that span continents. Some researchers believe that pattern recognition is tied to how people organize their surroundings. When a community settles in an area, they naturally begin identifying relationships that help them navigate. A hill might mark the edge of a territory. A stream might guide travel. A set of stones might indicate a boundary. These relationships become part of how people understand the land. When they build structures, these relationships influence placement. Because the environment contains recurring features, different communities develop similar interpretations even if they never meet. Another approach to understanding the human fascination with patterns comes from cognitive science. Studies show that people often perceive patterns even when none exist. This doesn't mean all observed alignments are accidental. Instead, it means humans have a strong tendency to connect information. When ancient people saw the sun rise in the same direction year after year, they didn't consider it a coincidence. They recognized it as a stable pattern worth marking. When they noticed a mountain always cast the same shadow at certain times of the year, they used that information. Over time, they incorporated these patterns into their cultural practices. Modern researchers studying ancient structures must account for this tendency. It helps explain why so many alignments appear across the world. Not all patterns are visual. Patterns are. People also notice patterns in sound, temperature, and tactile experience. For example, certain valleys amplify sound. Some hills block wind in predictable ways. Springs produce water that tastes or smells unique. These sensory patterns influence how humans experience the land. When a place offers consistent sensory cues, it becomes memorable. Ancient people often return to such places, and over time these locations gained significance. This created clusters of activity that later developed into sacred or ceremonial sites. When similar sensory experiences appear across continents, they produce similar patterns of settlement and structure. There is also the influence of social behaviour. Humans are communal by nature. They gather in places where they can meet, trade, or celebrate. Over time, these gathering spots become central to a community's identity. When several gatherings occur in similar types of locations, near water, in valleys, at crossroads, the resulting structures reflect shared social tendencies. Many monuments across the world appear in gathering places because those locations were already important before construction began. The similarity in placement emerges from the way communities naturally form around certain environmental features. In addition to cognitive tendencies, humans use patterns to predict the future. Ancient people relied heavily on predictable rhythms to prepare for seasonal changes. When patterns held true over long periods, they became the basis for rituals, calendars, and construction choices. If the sun rose at a certain point on the horizon during planting season, builders might align structures to that point. If the moon reached a predictable position during times of migration or harvest, that position might influence architecture. Similar cycles occur around the world, so different cultures adopted similar strategies. These shared responses appear as long-distance architectural and landscape patterns when viewed from a broad perspective. Another important factor is the way humans interpret randomness. When events occur without clear cause, people often search for patterns to explain them. This doesn't mean the patterns are imaginary. Instead, it means humans interpret complexity by finding order. For ancient people, the landscape was full of unexpected events: floods, storms, droughts, animal movements. By looking for patterns in these events, they created explanations that guided future decisions. When multiple cultures faced similar natural challenges, they developed similar interpretations. These interpretations influenced where they built, how they oriented structures, and how they organized their surroundings. Some of the most interesting patterns come from repeated geometric forms. Humans instinctively recognize shapes such as lines, circles, triangles, and rectangles. These shapes appear everywhere. When ancient people built structures, they used shapes that felt stable or easy to work with. Geometry provided a way to impose order on the environment. Rectangles help organize space efficiently. Circles create central gathering points. Triangles distribute weight. When structures with these shapes appear across continents, they reflect shared reasoning rather than shared culture. Psychologists studying how humans perceive landscapes have discovered that people tend to remember certain features more than others. High points, intersections, and distinct natural formations stand out. When people travel, they use these landmarks to navigate. When communities settle, they build near features that help them orient themselves. These tendencies produce consistent patterns across regions. When later researchers see structures placed near ridges, rivers, or cliffs, they identify connections that stem from shared cognitive preferences rather than direct communication between cultures. The human attraction to symmetry is another significant factor. People tend to find symmetrical shapes appealing. Symmetry suggests balance, stability, and order. When ancient builders created structures, symmetry helped them achieve structural reliability. It also made construction easier. When many cultures use symmetrical layouts, the resulting structures appear connected even if they arose from independent choices. Because symmetry is aesthetically pleasing and functionally effective, it appears consistently across time and geography. Another layer involves the human desire to link experiences. When people see two events occurring near each other, they look for relationships. This instinct creates the foundation of meaning-making. For ancient people, if a star rose at the same time a river flooded, they might assume a connection. If a shadow fell across a stone at the same moment each year, they interpreted it as significant. These connections influenced how people built monuments. Over time, people created structures that recorded the patterns they noticed. When similar environmental events occur in different regions, similar structures follow. The fascination with patterns also shapes how humans tell stories. Myths, legends, and histories all rely on narrative patterns. They describe cycles of creation, destruction, growth, and return. These cycles mirror the natural world. Seasons repeat. Water flows in familiar paths. Stars follow steady routes across the sky. People incorporated these cycles into their stories, and the stories influenced where they built structures. For instance, if a community's myth described a significant event occurring in the east, they might orient their structures toward the east. If another culture's stories described similar cycles, they might make the same choices independently. Understanding why people find patterns in the earth also helps explain why modern researchers see connections across continents. The human mind continues to look for order. When researchers map ancient sites, they notice alignments and similarities because their minds are wired to detect structure. This isn't a flaw, it's a useful tool, especially when interpreting ancient choices. However, the challenge is separating meaningful patterns from coincidental ones. Scientists use data and modelling to help distinguish between the two, but the underlying cognitive tendency remains the same. Another aspect worth considering involves how people respond emotionally to patterns. When people recognize a pattern, it creates a sense of understanding. This feeling can be comforting. For ancient people, recognizing patterns in the land helped reduce uncertainty. When communities built structures in places that matched recurring experiences, those structures offered reassurance. Over time, patterns in architecture reflect this desire for stability. When similar forms appear in distant regions, they reflect the same emotional need to create order in the world. Human curiosity also contributes to pattern recognition. People want to understand their environment, and they constantly search for clues about how the world works. This curiosity drives exploration, experimentation, and construction. Ancient people tested building methods, observed natural cycles, and refined their understanding of the land. When curiosity led different cultures to similar discoveries, the resulting structures reflect shared reasoning rather than shared origins. Another observation involves how people categorize the world. Humans group similar features together to make sense of complexity. For example, a culture that notices certain trees growing near water might associate those trees with fertility. Another culture elsewhere might make the same connection. These associations shape where stories are told, where ceremonies occur, and where structures are built. When similar associations appear across continents, similar architectural patterns follow. This attraction to patterns also influences how people relate to directions. Many cultures assign meaning to north, south, east, and west. These meanings differ, but the act of assigning meaning is consistent. Directions become part of how people navigate their world. When structures across continents face similar directions, it reflects shared methods of organizing space. For example, east often becomes significant because it is the direction of sunrise. When many cultures observe the same solar cycle, they develop similar architectural orientations. The human mind also responds to repeated experiences by forming expectations. When a particular event follows similar cues each year, people anticipate it. These expectations guide decisions about planting, travel, ceremony, and construction. Over time, expectations become traditions. When similar environmental cues occur across the world, similar traditions emerge, influencing the placement and design of structures. Finally, the fascination with patterns influences how people imagine the world beyond their immediate surroundings. When ancient people saw familiar patterns in distant places, such as mountains, stars, or coastlines, they interpreted them through the same framework used at home. This created a sense of continuity. Even if communities never met, their interpretations of the land followed consistent principles. These interpretations shaped how they built their structures and how they organized their landscapes. As the patterns linking ancient structures, landscapes, stories, and memory become more visible, it's natural to start thinking less about the structures themselves and more about what the broader picture suggests. People built these monuments for different reasons, in different environments, and within different cultural frameworks, yet the similarities in placement, orientation, and scale continue to stand out. These similarities don't point toward a single explanation, but they do reveal something about how humans across many ages approach the world. Instead of imagining a coordinated effort stretching across continents, it becomes more meaningful to consider how these patterns reflect the human experience. The networks carved into the landscape by ancient people speak not only to their past, but to the qualities that still shape how people interact with the world today. One of the strongest insights that comes from these patterns is that ancient communities were not passive observers of their surroundings. They studied the land closely, paying attention to details that often go unnoticed by modern society. People noticed how the sun moved across the sky and how shadows shifted during different seasons. They noticed which parts of the land produced the most reliable resources. They observed the sounds, temperatures, and changes that occurred in specific areas. When they built structures, they incorporated all of these observations. The patterns we see today show that ancient people didn't make careless decisions about placement. They built with purpose, grounded in long-term familiarity with their environment. This close relationship with the land shows that ancient people approached their surroundings with patience. Understanding seasonal patterns or geological stability requires years of attention. Builders needed time to observe the world and learn from it, They learned where flooding occurred, where sunlight fell in steady paths, and where the ground offered stable foundations. Over generations, these observations accumulated into shared knowledge. Structures built in places shaped by that knowledge preserved it physically. They acted as records of what communities learned over time. When we see similar decisions across continents, it highlights how universal the need for environmental understanding was. These networks also reveal something about how ancient societies prioritized community life. Many of the structures found across the world served as gathering places. They brought people together for ceremonies, trade, administration, or shared experience. The structures became central points where communities reinforced their identities. When looking at these networks today, one of the strongest impressions is that humans have always sought connection. Even when people lived in small, isolated communities, they created places designed for communal presence. This emphasis on gathering reflects a deep human need that continues today. People still create meeting spaces, though the forms have changed. Another message found in these networks involves stability. Ancient people built structures meant to last. They chose durable materials, stable foundations, and reliable shapes. The fact that many of these monuments remain today, despite natural disasters and long passage of time, shows that ancient builders considered longevity important. They weren't building temporary markers. They were creating lasting expressions of their knowledge, beliefs, and identity. The networks across continents reflect this shared intention. Even if the cultures differed in almost every other way, they shared the desire to leave something behind that would endure. These large-scale patterns also suggest that humans have always tried to understand their place in the world. When people align structures with the sky, they're situating themselves within a larger context. When they build on high places or near important natural features, they're anchoring their identity to the land. When they create structures connected by long-distance alignments, they're making sense of movement, direction, and meaning. These actions show that people everywhere wanted to belong to their environment in a meaningful way. They weren't content to exist without context. They wanted to understand how they fit into the larger picture. The networks also reveal something about how ancient people viewed time. Many of the structures built across the world measure time in some way. They track solstices, equinoxes, lunar cycles, or seasonal changes. These observations helped communities prepare for harvests, migrations, or ceremonies, but they also show that people recognized time as a repeating pattern. Instead of seeing each year as a separate experience, they saw cycles. They built monuments that reflect this understanding. These structures served as physical reminders that time moves in reliable rhythms. When similar timekeeping structures appear across continents, it shows that humans everywhere relied on these rhythms to guide their lives. Another insight involves the value ancient people placed on memory. Many structures were built to honor ancestors, commemorate events, or preserve stories. They served as anchors for the past. By building in consistent locations and maintaining these places over generations, communities preserved their identity. Even when structures changed or expanded, the original purpose often remained visible. When these patterns occur across continents, they show that memory played a central role in shaping human culture. People everywhere wanted to carry the past forward. The structures become part of how they accomplished that. These networks also reveal how ancient societies approached uncertainty. The world has always presented challenges. Natural disasters, climate changes, and resource limitations affected everyone. When communities faced unpredictable events, they often turned to patterns in the land and sky for guidance. Building structures aligned with consistent natural rhythms offered reassurance. It provided a sense of order in a world that could otherwise feel unpredictable. When similar responses appear across continents, they reflect a shared human need for stability during uncertain times. Another message contained in these networks is that humans value direction. Across many cultures, structures face specific orientations. They point towards sunrise, cardinal directions, prominent mountains, or water sources. These orientations reflect how people organize their world. They created mental frameworks that helped them navigate both physically and culturally. Even if the specific meanings differed from one culture to another, the act of assigning direction reveals an effort to categorize experience. This tendency appears across continents. The networks show that humans everywhere used orientation to give their surroundings coherent structure. The patterns also reflect the creativity of ancient builders. People experimented with different forms, shapes, and methods. Even when similar forms appear across continents, the variations demonstrate a wide range of ideas. Builders were adapting to their own regions while responding to universal challenges. They used materials available to them and invented techniques suited to local conditions. The resulting networks show both shared reasoning and cultural uniqueness. The similarities highlight shared human tendencies. The differences show how communities express those tendencies in their own ways. A deeper message within these networks involves the connection between movement and identity. Many ancient sites were built along travel routes. People moved through landscapes in regular patterns, and their structures reflect those movements. Paths between settlements, ceremonial destinations, or resource zones shaped how communities interacted. These paths eventually created large-scale networks. When similar networks appear across continents, they show that human identity has always been shaped by movement. People rarely stayed in one place permanently. Their journeys influenced their architecture, culture, and memory. The networks also reveal how humans respond to prominent features in the environment. Certain locations consistently attract attention. High points, bodies of water, unusual formations, and boundary zones often become centres of cultural activity. These features draw people in because they stand out and offer reliable reference points. When multiple cultures build in similar types of locations, the networks become clearer. These patterns show that humans everywhere use the land's most distinctive features as anchors for cultural development. Another message that emerges from these networks is that ancient societies often saw the land as an active partner rather than a passive setting. People didn't simply build wherever it was convenient. They interpreted the land's characteristics. They recognized its shifts, its signals, and its cycles. The structures reflect a dialogue between humans and the environment. When similar interactions appear across continents, they show that people everywhere developed relationships with their surroundings grounded in observation and respect. The large-scale patterns also reflect the adaptability of ancient people. They lived in diverse climates and environments, yet many of their solutions resemble one another. They adapted their architecture to withstand local weather, availability of materials, and geological conditions. They responded to similar problems with similar reasoning. This adaptability shaped the networks we see today. It shows that humans are resourceful and capable of developing efficient solutions across a wide range of circumstances. These networks also say something about communication. While there is little evidence for direct long-distance contact between many ancient cultures, the patterns show that communities communicated well within their regions. Ideas spread across neighbouring groups, influencing architectural methods, measurement units, and building traditions. Over generations, these regional connections created broader patterns that appear significant when viewed at a large scale. The networks show that communication doesn't need to span continents to produce global similarities. Local exchanges can accumulate to create widespread effects. Another insight lies in the balance between individuality and universality. Each culture expressed its values, beliefs, and needs through its structures, yet many of those expressions resemble one another because they emerge from universal human concerns. The networks show this balance clearly. People everywhere confronted similar challenges, observed similar natural cycles, and used similar reasoning to create solutions. The structures reflect both cultural uniqueness and shared human experience. These networks also highlight the importance of continuity. Many ancient structures were built in phases. Communities added to them, restored them, or rebuilt them over centuries. This continuity shows that people valued long-term connections to place. The land became intertwined with the community's identity. When similar patterns of continuity appear across continents, they reveal that humans everywhere invest meaning in long-term relationships with place. Finally, the network suggests that humans are deeply connected to the idea of meaning itself. People didn't build structures only for practical reasons. They built because they sought purpose, understanding, and connection. They built because they wanted to interpret their world and leave something behind that expressed their experiences. These networks reflect that search for meaning. The alignments, placements, and patterns across continents are physical evidence of how humans have always tried to understand themselves through their environment. Reaching this point in the journey, the many threads that stretch across ancient landscapes begin to settle into view in a way that feels different from when they were first introduced. Earlier sections move through geometry, memory, movement, stories, and patterns one layer at a time. Now, as all those details gather together, the entire subject feels less like a list of separate ideas and more like a single framework built from countless observations. The world of ancient monuments doesn't present itself as a puzzle with one neat solution. Instead, it forms a long, interconnected map created by people who lived in a world shaped by direct experience with the land, the sky, and the rhythms around them. What remains today is the imprint of those experiences preserved in stone, earth, and orientation, waiting for modern people to notice and ask new questions. Looking back across the earlier ideas, one of the clearest impressions is how thoroughly ancient communities engaged with the physical spaces around them. They weren't guessing when they chose their building sites. They weren't selecting locations at random. They identified the places that consistently provided resources, stability, or clarity. Some sites offered good visibility, others offered protection. Some allowed for tracking sunlight or seasonal events. Others served as centres of community life. Each decision added to a growing pattern of human interaction with the landscape, and over time, these patterns spread across regions until they formed the broader network seen today. These networks don't require speculation about unreachable origins. They reflect thousands of years of steady, repeated choices guided by environmental cues. Moving through these patterns also reveals how ancient people understood their role in the world. Modern societies often separate nature, culture, science, and daily life into different categories. Ancient people didn't. They lived with all these elements combined. A river wasn't just a water source, it was also a boundary, a travel path, a seasonal predictor, and a subject of stories. A mountain wasn't only a landmark, it was a directional anchor, a place of ceremony, a sheltering presence, and a visual reference. When people built monuments near such features, they were integrating their structures into a larger context that reflected how they saw themselves and their surroundings. This perspective helps explain why similar types of sacred sites appear across continents, even when cultures developed independently. As the networks spanning the ancient world come into clearer focus, it also becomes easier to appreciate the depth of time involved. The earlier structures precede written records. Many were built by communities that passed their knowledge through observation and memory rather than through text. With each generation, these communities added new layers to the landscape. Some built simple markers, some built large monuments, some aligned structures with the sky, while others aligned them with landforms or travel routes. Over centuries, the accumulated decisions created geographic patterns that are still visible. When researchers map these patterns today, the long time span behind them becomes part of the story. Every point in the network represents not just a place, but a series of choices made over many lives. The depth of time also explains why some patterns feel mysterious. Landscapes change, rivers shift course, forests grow and disappear, coastlines move. As the land changes, some alignments that were once obvious become harder to notice. Others become clearer as vegetation recedes or erosion exposes older structures. Some sites that were once central become isolated. Others that were once isolated become central. When modern people interpret these shifting networks, they're seeing a mixture of ancient intentions and natural changes that altered how the world looks. What seems like hidden design may sometimes reflect how long the land has been in motion. Returning to the role of stories, memory provided a structure that helped ancient people make sense of these changes. Many stories preserved details about the landscape before writing existed. Some explained why certain places mattered. Others described movements of people, cycles of seasons, or important events. Even if the stories later shifted or became symbolic, the underlying purpose remained similar. They helped people remember connections between places. When structures appear along paths described in myths, it suggests those stories guided decisions about where to build. When multiple cultures show similar uses of story to guide memory, the long-distance similarities become easier to understand. They're an expression of a shared human method for navigating time. Another layer worth revisiting is the idea of direction. Orientation appears repeatedly across cultures because directional cues help organize the world. People oriented structures toward sunrise, toward mountains, toward water, or toward important regions. These orientations weren't chosen at random. They helped define the purpose of a structure. They guided ceremonies. They created visual connections with the broader environment. When many cultures selected similar directional anchors, the resulting monuments formed long-distance lines that feel deliberate. Yet their origins lie in practical, repeatable decisions, rather than in coordinated communication across continents. Patterns in travel add another important component. Ancient routes often followed natural paths formed by rivers, ridges, and valleys. These paths connected settlements, seasonal sites, and resource areas. Over time, communities built structures along these pathways, reinforcing their significance. When several routes converged, those intersections became major centres of activity. When researchers study modern maps of ancient sites, these travel patterns emerge clearly. They reveal why some regions contain clusters of monuments, while others contain long, straight alignments. The travel networks didn't need to be connected globally to create patterns that resemble global networks when viewed from a large-scale perspective. Returning again to engineering and architecture, the consistency in structural solutions across continents reflects the shared problem-solving abilities of humans. People needed stable platforms, durable foundations, weather-resistant materials, and reliable shapes. They experimented with available resources, they tested different building methods, they kept the ones that worked and passed them down. When many cultures face similar challenges, the solutions they adopted often look similar. These similarities reveal less about direct contact and more about the universal nature of human reasoning. Taken together, all these elements — placement, orientation, memory, story, measurement, travel routes, environmental observation, and shared problem-solving — fill in the spaces between the most visible patterns. Instead of viewing the networks as discrete lines stretching across continents, it becomes possible to see them as the byproduct of how humans everywhere have interacted with the land over thousands of years. Not a hidden system, but a collective record of choices shaped by experience. The presence of these networks also provides insight into how ancient people viewed connection itself. Communities may not have known about faraway cultures, but they still built their world in ways that encouraged cohesion. Structures tied villages to gathering places linked settlements to wider regions linked to broader landscapes through trade routes, ceremonial cycles, and seasonal patterns. These ties created woven webs of human movement and meaning long before globalization existed. When modern researchers see similar webs across distant continents, they're witnessing a universal pattern of human behavior that appears whenever communities organize themselves over long periods. Another perspective that emerges from these networks concerns how humans respond to complexity. ancient people faced many challenges: unpredictable weather, limited resources, environmental risks, and the need for cooperation. They responded by building systems of understanding. Alignments helped track time. Monuments helped define territory. Stories helped preserve knowledge. Architecture helped create stability. These systems reduced uncertainty, and they became part of cultural identity. When similar responses appear across continents, they reveal how humans everywhere use structure to manage complexity. The networks also highlight the role of continuity in human culture. Ancient communities rarely started from nothing. They built on earlier traditions, expanded existing structures, and reinforced familiar practices. Over time, this continuity created layered landscapes. When researchers see long-distance patterns today, they're seeing the results of these accumulated layers. Shared approaches to building, organizing, and interpreting the world didn't arise overnight. They developed slowly, shaped by the same human tendencies repeated across generations. As modern people look back at these patterns, the networks reveal something else: the desire to leave behind traces of existence. Ancient structures, whether large or small, served as lasting markers of human presence. They recorded decisions, beliefs, observations, and identities. They remain in the landscape long after the people who built them are gone. When these markers form patterns across continents, they show how deeply humans have always wanted their experiences to endure. Another insight that comes from reflecting on these networks is that humans have always been curious. The act of noticing patterns, questioning their meanings, and exploring their origins is not a modern invention. Ancient people observed the land with curiosity. They experimented with alignments. They refined building techniques. They tested explanations for natural events. That curiosity shaped their world. Now, modern curiosity shapes how researchers interpret the past. The networks between ancient sites become more visible not because they were hidden, but because technology now allows people to see them from new perspectives. The networks also encourage a broader view of human history. Instead of seeing civilizations as isolated or incomparable, these patterns show that many communities face similar challenges and responded with similar solutions. This doesn't diminish cultural diversity. Instead, it highlights shared human tendencies. It shows that people everywhere relied on observation, reasoning, memory, and creativity. It shows that even when cultures developed independently, they were guided by comparable interactions with the land. Looking at the networks from this perspective doesn't reduce the sense of wonder. If anything, it enhances it. The consistency with which humans across time and geography recognize patterns in the Earth illustrates a remarkable level of awareness. It shows the depth of connection people have always felt to their surroundings. It shows how long the human relationship with the land has shaped culture, identity, and understanding. As all these ideas come together, the networks no longer look like hidden lines waiting to be uncovered. They look like reflections of human experience preserved across landscapes. They show how people throughout history created meaning from their surroundings and left physical traces of that meaning. They reveal how consistent human curiosity, problem-solving, and observation have been across thousands of years. Moving toward the end of this journey, the subject becomes less about solving a mystery and more about seeing the ancient world as a connected expression of shared human tendencies. The structures scattered across continents aren't isolated puzzles. They're pieces of a long, ongoing relationship between people and the land. They're reminders of how humans everywhere have shaped their environments deliberately, carefully, and with attention to cycles still present today. The networks that stretch across the Earth reflect not only the capabilities of ancient builders, but also the continuity of human thought. They reveal that across time and geography, people have recognized similar patterns, responded to similar conditions, and expressed similar priorities. These structures remain as physical evidence of those priorities, forming a web that still connects the modern world to the experiences of ancient communities.